the tenant was actually evicted because she was running a drug, like she was, again, we're going back to drugs. It just is a
it's a different podcast again.
And the evidence was clear. We're talking video evidence of like 15 people going in and out of the apartment at 1 minute spurts, over multiple dates, with a known drug dealer coming out of that building that was caught. Perfect. And they evicted her on the first round. Tenant appealed.
Welcome to Real Stories in Real Estate. I'm your host, Nicolee Evans, and today we have Brady Bodley with us to share about his experiences with the Landlord Tenant Board. Welcome, Brady. So, tell us about your experiences with the Landlord and Tenant Board, because you have a couple of different perspectives that you're coming at.
Yes. So just a little bit of background about me. I'm a lawyer at Thomas Efraim. So my kind of experience is kind of working with a student job first. It was a property management company that managed 3 different properties for students. And then also just as a lawyer during my articling, having to deal with some landlord-tenant board issues. So I guess what I want to start with is dealing with the landlord-tenant board as a landlord is not great.
Yeah. We hear that a lot. Yeah.
Yes. The legislation is written very for the tenants. So,
okay.
And that can make things very difficult. There's a lot of rules that you have to follow, and they give a lot of leeway to tenants, as we saw.
But not landlords.
It's very hard for a landlord. Now, I think this might be a different topic for another podcast. Commercial landlords are very different, but I guess we'll save that for another one.
Yeah, let's stick to residential today, because I think your experience is fairly unique in that you kind of have multiple viewpoints. So your first experience was as a landlord, essentially, like in that role, right?
Well, I mean, it's all the common stuff you deal with, right? It's, if someone doesn't pay rent, what do you do? There's only so many times you can send notices. And if someone's really not going to pay rent, then, you have to file a notice of eviction. And that whole process in itself is not like a quick file and done, The tenant can appeal. And then you have to do submissions. That's time, that's money.
Yeah.
And the whole court process for the Landlord Tenant Board is what I would like to call in law the wild, wild west. There is not a formal really set of rules for evidence and procedure. It is very kind of all over the place.
Which is very different from the kind of law you practice now and how regimented it is. It's not a set process then as much?
Yeah, it's, if you go to you want to do like a civil case, for example, there's a lot of like rules of civil procedure that you need to follow.
Okay.
The Landlord Tenant Board, is very almost administrative tribunal. So it's kind of very, they can kind of set their own rules a lot of the time, to put it simply, right?
Okay. And in your experience with that role, when you were in that student job, was it consistent or like time to time going there, or was it like each time would be something different?
So, I mean, there's a lot of different things that I would have dealt with, right? Like obviously not paying rent with students was a big one. And there's really not much you can do unless you do the notice of eviction and you file to get them out. And if they appeal, then you have to go into the court. Now, there are certain situations, obviously being in a student apartment building, there is other things that I would have dealt with in terms of, disputes between roommates. And, there are some things that you can get a tenant out pretty quickly, but it has to be, a lot of it comes down to if it's like a safety concern. Right. So I'll give an example here of a story where it was at the student apartment building, and one of the tenants had someone come over and they were dealing drugs out of the apartment.
I'm not super shocked that would be happening in a student building, but it's still it's a concern. Like as the landlord, that you have to safety concern and all kinds of things, I'm sure.
So what ended up happening, and we got these tenants out fairly quickly was that
Yeah.
they had pretty much set someone up to come over and they got stabbed.
Oh, that's a huge safety concern then.
So at that point, it was a little, that's an emergency situation. You can get a tenant very quick. But in terms of, this is obviously a very, out of the ordinary circumstance.
Sure.
But, the kind of the standard stuff, dealing with non-payment of rent. And then just in terms of, not fixing something, right? If the landlord, if there's something that needs to be fixed and you don't do it, a lot of the times the tenant is not obligated to pay until you fix that. And that
is there a threshold for that? Like in your experience with dealing like in as a landlord or representing the landlord, is there a threshold that like, the landlord tenant board like recognizes a threshold of like when tenants can't pay?
Well, they look at like if the tenant did damage, obviously that, if they do the damage and it gets fixed, then obviously they're responsible for paying. But again, good luck getting that out of them.
Right. And I wonder if it's more of a like obviously student housing presents its own specific, challenges. I have some rental properties and generally I haven't, knock on wood, had to go through any process that involved a landlord tenant board, but it is interesting as, a property investor, just the level of responsibility between as a landlord versus when you're actually renting. Like I rented for years, like when I was a student and prior to purchasing a property. And I think that there is a lack of awareness on both sides, people who are tenants and people who are landlords about what even the role is of the landlord tenant board and like what is like something that you could escalate to that situation. Again, I haven't had to do that. My tenants are fantastic, which is wonderful. But you do hear a lot of horror stories, especially from the landlord side, but equally from a rental side. So
yeah, of course. And that's also what the landlord tenant board is there to do. So a big one for, if we're going to be more tenant specific complaints is, tenants have a legal kind of right to, oh my gosh, what's it called? It's slipping my mind. It's been a busy day, guys. I apologize. But reasonable enjoyment of their property.
Right. Yes, of course. Yeah.
So if a landlord, is coming over all the time, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't have these guests here.
Yeah.
I've heard of those problems too with tenants. So the purpose of the landlord tenant board is ultimately to be the final ruling for disputes between landlords and tenants, right?
Yeah.
And as much as, yes, tenants can be bad, there are equally landlords too. If something is broken, like a heater in the middle of winter time, my personal opinion would be like, you shouldn't pay rent until that's fixed. That's part of your tenancy.
And that's, and I think that there's and again, I'm like kind of too naive and ignorant about some of these things because given that I do own rental properties, and I really do feel that people should be a bit more informed in situations that they're in. So like with the landlord tenant board, is there a lot of do they have resources? Like in your experience, like in your role, did you go to them with questions or were there things that you were able to do with them that was helpful before the tribunal stage of things?
Yeah, they do have like a helpline. And some of the times when, I have called as behalf of a landlord, be like, listen, here's the situation. And they kind of give you, I don't want to say legal advice, but they kind of give you information saying, this is what you should do next.
Okay.
So one of the situations, for example, is a big problem sometimes is assigning a lease, right? So this is a situation where, maybe you can't rent, but you found somebody else and you want to sublet or assign and the landlord is kind of unreasonably refusing, right? So in that situation, if the because there's certain rules like that, you have to, you obviously have to give written notice, but they can't unreasonably withhold an assignment, right? And that's what sometimes they can do, right? For a multitude of different reasons. So even just a tenant going to the landlord board and saying, hey, this is the situation. I sent out the letter. They refused to do this. They can give you guidance and say, this is what I would recommend you doing. File this application. This is what you do.
Yeah.
I think the good thing about the Landlord Tenant Board is, and my friends who are lawyers doing this are not going to like to hear this, but a lot of it can be pretty well done with minimal assistance, I think, in a certain
Which was actually going to be my question. You know, we've talked a bit about your experience when in your student job, but like as a lawyer, like you've had to deal with them as like a legal representative as well.
Yeah.
Like, do people going to the Landlord Tenant Board need to retain legal counsel, or is it something they can do without that, or it depends on the situation?
You don't technically need a lawyer really to do much, to be honest.
Okay. Like, I'm not trying to talk you out of a job or anything here.
Yeah, no. But for the landlord, I mean, I think it really depends on the facts of the case, right? If it's something, I think a lawyer is just better at presenting the legal arguments and driving your facts to a better solution. Okay. And they're going to know what to do with the judge. They're going to know what's relevant. Okay. Again, it has to do with quantum too, right? And the situation. A lot of people can't afford it. And I don't believe legal aid will cover landlord tenant board stuff. So it comes down to money as well. For landlords too, that I would definitely recommend a lawyer more for the landlords. But that process, you know, it is quite, you're not going to get a tomorrow solution. We're talking, you know, at this point, if you were to file an application, you might get in front of the board in 4 months if you were lucky.
Oh, wow. And that's from both sides, either as a tenant or a landlord?
Yeah.
Well, that's good to know because, yeah, like, you know, like, as you mentioned, there's certain situations like where someone was stabbed or like the heating's broken in the middle of winter that are actually urgent situations. Do those get addressed at a different speed in your experience?
I think for something like, I haven't dealt too much with that type of an emergency situation. Okay. In my situation, I think the tenants kind of were like, yeah, we're not going to fight this.
Well, it's hard to fight
to stay here. It's, you know, but I don't, I would think so. I don't necessarily practice heavily in the area to have dealt with that much.
And like realistically, I appreciate you talking from your experience because that's what we always want to do with our podcast is talk from your real experience. And I think that the awareness of the Landlord Tenant Board and even like, you know, we've talked about different sides, different experiences, and a lot of people have concerns with it, but there are good things about this, having this in place, because otherwise it's a two-person disagreement. And so ultimately, what is the job of the Landlord Tenant Board is to find a solution, right?
Find a solution to people's problems.
Yeah.
It's almost like an arbitration, right? This is going to be the final. But that's the problem too, right? And this is what also I would caution people with this, and I'll get into that. So just because they rule at one point, you can appeal a decision as well.
Oh, okay.
So this is another situation I had where the tenant was actually evicted because she was running a drug, again, we're going back to drugs. It just is
it's a different podcast again.
And the evidence was clear. We're talking video evidence of like 15 people going in and out of the apartment at 1 minute spurts, over multiple dates, with a known drug dealer coming out of that building that was caught. And they evicted her on the first round. Tenant appealed because it was social housing. Tenant appealed. They granted her the appeal. So then they had to retry the issue again.
So in that process, and she was evicted, did she actually leave the premises?
No, because she appealed it and they granted it.
So as soon as she lodged the appeal, then she was able to stay.
Well, because they give you a certain time frame, right? It's not like
okay.
So in this situation, they gave her a time frame. You had to leave within this number of days, or else the sheriff was going to.
Yes.
But then she appealed, and then they granted the appeal. So then she stayed there for another probably year. And then during this whole time, the landlord is angry because he's not getting paid rent for this whole time.
Yeah.
She already was evicted. They're appealing. And then because of the backlog in COVID at the time, they adjourned the appeal hearing 3 times. The landlord tenant board, not even the thing. So, and then eventually he spends all this money. The tenant just decided to leave so that it was done.
Do you have any tips for people who are dealing with the landlord tenant board, that like kind of best practices for people?
I think just in any area of law, just to, have your evidence, your facts straight. Don't change your stories around. If you're going to put something down on a piece of paper and submit something, make sure that it's true and that everything you kind of say, you have proof to back it up. Because
that is good advice for all aspects of law. And on that, Brady, can you tell us a bit about what you do in your day-to-day, like what your business is, what area of law you're practicing in?
Yes. Currently? So I practice in the areas of corporate, wills, and family law.
Okay.
So my day-to-day can change very drastically depending on what is the problem of the day. So if I'm working on an asset purchase deal and something goes awry, my attention has to go to that. If then I'm dealing with something with a family law, that always happens. There's fires on that. So kind of the day-to-day is what I have planned, and what ends up happening usually is the polar opposite. So
it keeps it interesting though. And if people have any questions for you about what we discussed today or about your business and your services as a legal professional, where do they find you?
Yeah, so I practice right now at the law firm Thomas Efraim LLP. It's located in Oshawa. I'm new to the firm. I just started.
I was like, it's a new role. So
new role, yes.
Your email. Do you have an email?
Yeah, so it's brady@thomasefraimllp.com.
Perfect.
And if you have any questions, about corporate, family, or tax, even reviewing a lease, if you need kind of legal advice about that, that's the other thing I guess I would say to caution tenants about too, now that we're kind of talking of this, is it's legislated what is allowed to be put into a lease.
Absolutely.
Even if the landlord does put it, it's very clear in the legislation that if it's certain things that they put in there, it's void. That clause is void. A big one is pets.
Yeah, and pets is one, right? And different things around that. So awesome talking with you today, Brady, about this. I think that we covered a lot of different things in our 15 minutes here about working with the Landlord Tenant Board. So I want to thank everyone for tuning in to Real Stories in Real Estate podcast today. You can check out this and other episodes on our website, www.laframboisemortgage.ca, or anywhere you consume your podcasts like Spotify, Apple, or iHeartRadio. Thank you for checking us out today.